So friends, the last point that was touched upon by Dr. Richa Bajaj, our expert today, was regarding the importance of the character and how the character sometimes leads the short story writer onto a journey that takes him or her to its required ending. So maybe there's more to say on this by Dr. Bajaj, or maybe she has to shift now to the other points like history, how short story evolved in history, how it is shaped by the present requirements, and how it might appeal in the times to come. So in a way, time is an important factor maybe as captured in the short story. One wonders what the answer would be and whether Dr. Richa Bajaj would like to enlighten us on this. So please take up this point and whatever other points you have to share.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. So since you mentioned the character, let's look at one quote from the author excuses himself from the book Creatures of Circumstances by Somerset Maugham, and you will be able to see it on your screens now since we were discussing the idea of character. So Somerset Maugham actually disagreed with the view of early critics that that the short story, the main aim of the short story, and he says, should be building of character, and incidents are secondary to it, where incidents should merely liven personality, end quote. Now you see the idea that this is a kind of a perpetual problem that the short story has faced, and that's why I wanted to bring it before you all, whether should we see the short story as reader centric, or should the short story be seen as character centric, or for that matter as incident centric. So these are some of the ways in which several critics have noted their opinion on the issue. But what is true is the fact that 100 and 150 years that the short story's development took place from 19th century onwards, that short story has defied really a kind of a fixed pattern. So there is no particular set of rules that suggest that the short story has to have the character, the building up of the character should be the mainstay of the story, or the incidents should be the mainstay of the story, or it has to be symbolic and it has to be mysterious. In fact, short stories have been of all kinds. They have also gone over that there are different types of short stories. There is travel writing, there is science fiction in the short story, there are there is love, romance, which is also there. There are religious texts which are moral also in nature. So the short story also has is in that sense has cut across all these different genres as well. So it's not to say, and even letter writing is a part of it. So a short story in many ways is whatever the writer wants it to be, in that sense. So these are discussions that one should be aware of, whether what is the general stance of writers on the short story as such. And when Pritchard said it's a glimpse, or when you have Somerset Maugham saying that incidents are important. Again, Somerset Maugham also criticized Chekhov's idea, for instance, of short story, because Chekhov said that people don't go to the mountains every day. People have cabbage soups and people have ordinary lives. So Chekhov's idea was to bring in the extraordinary in the ordinary, in that sense, to be able to look for a significant moment in the ordinary lives of characters, of people. But Somerset Maugham said that, well, but people do want to imagine some other things. They may not want to see face to face the life that they have led, right? So that also brings in the question of how realistic the short story should be, and whether the short story has in it the capacity to break the bounds of realism and move in another category. And so you find the 20th century short story is different in that sense from the 19th century one, because there the boundaries are always being pushed and newer categories of fiction, short fiction, are coming to the fore. Now, let me actually take you to the history of this kind of an endeavor, that when we speak of the short story and the 19th century short story, we are actually looking at the modern short story, because short stories have been written and have been in existence since forever, since time immemorial, since human beings began to live in a kind of a community, right? So stories have been there for the last 3,000 years, but we seem to see the beginning of the modern short story as the one that takes shape in the 19th century. Now, you see, when we look at stories from oral narratives, for instance, then there were primitive societies where people sat around campfire and there were storytellers who would tell legendary tales. There would be stories about the wars of war of gods, for instance. There would be stories around the planets, about the sun and the moon, the adventure tales of hunting, and so on and so forth. So stories have always been an important part of human activity and human life. And you see, and it's also a gift that is passed on from one generation to another. Also, stories are something that a human being actually gains hope from, because we all want to become successful stories for, say, the next generation, or for people to talk about. We like to, our sense of success would not mean, or our sense of failure would not mean much to us, but because it means that as a story we have failed, as a life story we have we have succeeded. Why do we read autobiographies? Because these are life stories which are real, and in some way, in their own field, they are successful. So the stories, therefore, I think story is an integral part of human activity and human endeavor. And human beings have always lived with hearing anecdotes, for instance, of elders, recollections, tales, reminiscences, and personal histories and recording of events. All these are a part of that story that we speak of. So stories are also memories in that sense, and memory is by nature imaginative. You know, as much as you want to take out the real in memory, you will find that the memory is always sweeter, and therefore more, because it is more imaginative in your mind, and it has already attained a pattern and a form and a color in the mind. So memory, as we carry it, is a story that we carry in our minds, and there are therefore several stories that exist, and they contribute to human living process. So that is one aspect of looking at stories. The other aspect that you have seen, that stories have existed in, say, religious texts, you know, in parables, in Bible, in the Vedas, in Panchatantra stories, in Aesop's tales, animal tales that we know, all of them, in Old Testament stories of David, etc. You find that they are all stories at the end of the day that have become a part of a larger narrative, because stories have been the best way through which masses could be educated. So it has always had a very educative function. While because of its nature that it is imaginative, it is pleasurable, right? The imaginative angle of it gives a sense of pleasure. But because it is crisp, short narrative, it is the easiest way to get to the people. In fact, people like Premchand also noted that the short story is meant for the ordinary people, because the novel is meant for those who have the time and the money to invest in the novel. For a person, the ordinary folk, there is no real time to spend days of reading a novel, because there is a lot to be, you have so many pressures of life working on you. So a story becomes an apt way of getting across an idea fast. In that sense. So stories but have had these different sort of phases, right? There have been oral narratives, there have been religious texts and religious narratives, fables and animal tales. Then there have been stories of enchantment and thrills and gothic kind of stories where monsters exist, terrifying tales of monsters, or the moral educative kind. But the kind of story that that we talk of, in the 19th century, the evolution of the modern short story actually took shape in the 19th century when the development of periodical literature came up. And the periodical literature in the 19th century in Europe and America therefore gave boost to the short story, because the magazine market, therefore offered a space to the short story writers. There were these magazine stories that were doing the rounds, right? So the periodicals, journals that had come up in the 18th century and were mostly about essays. Soon in the 19th century, you found that those magazines were giving space to short story writers. Also, the print culture, the boom in the print culture, because of mass circulation now of books and of magazines. So you find that that the magazine market actually gave this kind of boost to the short story in the 19th century, where for the first time writers could actually earn remuneration through their creative practice. Add to this another element that there was a mass middle class literacy rate in the 19th century. 19th century population was a literate population, and this mass middle class was now eager to read and to learn through the written word. And that was also responsible for this kind of an intellectual churning. Remember that women were an important part in Europe and America who were also reading a lot of this literature in their homes, because obviously they could not go out to work. So, and they had turned into a middle class, so they were not even doing the household chores. So they had limited activities to pursue. And reading became this kind of an important way through which they nurtured their self and also became cultured, within quotes really, but that was the way through which they were able to develop or self-fashion their own selves, right? So both long and short fiction actually gained a boost during this period. Now, with the rise of the prose fiction, really, this rise of prose fiction was actually accompanied with this kind of evolution of the authorial stance or attitude also. And that I find is very interesting, because the moment you are dealing with an issue or a problem, you are also dealing with ideas, and the writer also, this also leads to the evolution of an authorial stance or an authorial attitude. The writer is forced to take a stance. This is how the fiction writing of the 18th and the 19th century in fact necessitated debates about issues both within the literary space and outside the imaginative domain, in the sphere of essays, where critical discussions were taking place about empirical themes, etc. But what I'm saying is that the question of debate, of conflict, of collision of ideas comes to the fore once there is mass circulation of books, there is mass literacy, and there are writers who are being paid to write, and then they are also developing an attitude and a kind of an intellectual stance. So the modern short story, I would go on to suggest, is more idea centric than its counterpart for what in whatever centuries we've known. It doesn't necessarily have a kind of an admonishing function or an educative function. It is not trying to teach anything, it is trying to explore. So fiction related with political, cultural attitudes actually opened itself to intellectual examination. So intellectual examination, and I would take this further to suggest that ideological stance or ideological reflections and propositions were also becoming a part of the larger short writing of the short fiction. So I think intellectual examination of character, of people, of situations, of life issues, and by intellectual examination I also mean the cultural attitudes at the time, the political attitudes at the time, all of these were being now projected in the short story. And with Chekhov and the advent of the 20th century, you actually see that the modern short story enters its golden age. And I'm actually, look at the quote of William Boyd here. He says that with Chekhov and with the advent of the 20th century, the modern short story entered its golden age, unquote. Now, the short story affirms common life, much like the novel, because the novel is of course a middle class genre and is setting out to create a heroic middle class ordinary individual, to look for the heroic in the ordinary individual. So the short story in that sense is, affirms to that kind of common life and is a product of modernity. Now modernity therefore is defined not by something new, but rather where conflicting values and conflicting ideas are presented, and that is what I think is the mainstay of the modern short story, which is also why Chekhov, who was otherwise a votary of the realistic projection of life, he believed in open-ended narratives. He believed that a significant issue could be highlighted even in the most drab details of life. In a letter, in fact, and with this, I would also invite Professor Prakash to comment on this. In a letter that Chekhov actually wrote to A.S. Savurin, his friend, he outlined his concept of writing, and he said, and I quote, "You confuse two concepts, the solution of a problem and its correct presentation, Only the second is incumbent on the artist, unquote. Now, Chekhov's endings seldom, solved anything for the reader. They in fact desisted from any conventional closure to the works. He was more. So, in fact, I would like Professor Prakash to tell me what he thinks of this kind of a quote, that you confuse two concepts, the solution of a problem and its correct presentation. Only the second is incumbent on the writer. That is, the correct presentation is incumbent on the writer, not the solution to a problem. So, to what extent do you think the short story solves the problems, or do you think that it's just the presentation that is more important?
No, as you have posed the question, for Chekhov, the important thing is the convincingness of the short story. The short story should be able to convince the reader about its reality, about its veracity. And for that, a kind of a logic, a kind of a realistic understanding of life, a kind of appeal which directly involves the reader and his concentration, that is important. That's why perhaps the short stories of Chekhov always, have an eye on the expectant reader. The reader is expecting something, and the writer is trying to fulfill those expectations. So, and he's an experimentalist also. He may not say it himself, but Chekhov's short stories have a great deal of variety in them. And sometimes, the characters who are supposed to be otherwise idealistic are shown as very shallow by him. I straight away, as you were asking this question, the example of the bride, came to mind. And where, a person who was exploring was rejected by everybody, and she ran away. And when she came back, by that time the world had changed. So the writer is asking a question as to why, this person ran away, and whether he or she is happy. And when she came back, then the world had changed. So these are the questions that he is posing, and he is not answering them. So
yes. So, my question, and this is something that I was also thinking about, that, the ancient story has been a story where idealism has been the center of it, the evil, good is rewarded, right? And evil is conquered in that sense. So, the fight between the good and evil and all of those categories. So it is always idealistic. 19th century is a realistic take on life. So there is the idealistic story, and there is the realistic story. And in the 20th century, say with Kipling and others, you enter the phase of the modernist story, which is more intellectual and experimental in its form. So and very soon you will enter the phase of modernism or modernist story. So my own apprehension is that, does it mean that realism in a way restricts the writer from giving any kind of, within quote, solution? And would we say that the function of literature is to be idealistic? When I say idealistic, I don't mean a sort of, and I do mean actually, that you want to see the resolution. In life it may not be available, but you want to see that this is possible. Is literature the domain of possibility and imaginative, creative fulfillment, and therefore idealistic by nature? And the moment you call something realistic, you are saying that it is a mirror that you are showing to life. But in life, those things may not occur. So I'm trying to understand whether you would say idealistic sort of a story, or a realistic sort of a story, or a modernist sort of a story is preferable. I mean, what kind of a story would you prefer?
I think you already suggested the answer yourself. It has to be exploratory. It should not fall into a pattern. If the pattern emerges, that's the problem of the reader and all those things. But the important point you made in the beginning of your discussion was that short story actually is a kind of form of the memory. That when you think of yesterday, when something happened, then you are storing it in your mind as a short story,
right,
as a kind of a narrative, and that has its independent form. So the writer doesn't have any aim, to pursue through it, because already the short story has taken its form evolved its form in the mind of the reader, of the writer.
Right. So what I said was that memory is imaginative.
Yes.
You know, and literature is imaginative.
Yes.
You know, and literature
Not bound by the realistic demands.
Right.
But
Not
by
bound by the realistic demands. So if you demand the short story to be realistic, you're not saying that it has to show life as it is, but how life should be. And the moment you go into the direction of the should be, then you're in the dangerous zone of idealism, and you might be then accused of being utopian. So I therefore find this discussion very interesting. To what extent should we include idealism? And you know, idealism, till the time it was of the moral kind, and till the time it was about spiritual goodness and about it solved moral spiritual problems, it still was in the domain of the larger ethical religious paradigm. But the moment you have taken this creative visualization and made it secular in the 19th century and turned this kind of a creative imaginative exercise where you are focusing on the should be without the moral ethical code of conduct, but basing it on human hopes and aspirations, then you have also become real in the process. You know, you're closer to human being, because you're not talking about some divine sense of right and wrong. You're talking about the right and wrong that exists in everyday life, and the hopes and aspirations and the dreams of human being, what they're known for, and the potential in them. You know, and all these bring you towards a kind of realism of this sort.
And what is real can also be ideal?
I think that's the question I was asking. Can real be called ideal? Because in general parlance, that's not the case. The ideal is always seen as a utopian sort of a category, and the real is seen to be too realistic, almost to the T, so much so that you would say that in that, like 20th century modernist fiction writer would accuse 19th century realism for being too banal and too realistic in that sense, and their flights of imagination, which are more abstract in the 20th century, they're a kind of reaction to this kind of realistic sort of short fiction.
I think the problem is with the realistic, as you call it, because real means that, you know, which is accepted by everybody as unchanging. That's what real is. But actually real is that which is taking you into itself and then compelling you to think about it. And that, as you rightly said, literature is intellectual, it is imaginative, and it's all the time questioning things. And if that is happening, then I think this questioning aspect is real. It is human, you know, it is human to be imaginative. Right. It is human to be interested in the real. So real has, I think the scope of realism has to be expanded to include even the ideal. Because human beings pursue certain ideals, whether they like it or not. Friends like to help one another, and within the family the mother would like to help her children, and vice versa. And if that is idealistic, then that is the problem of the philosopher. So far as the living human beings are concerned, they would always pursue, directly or indirectly, knowingly or unknowingly, some kind of an ideal, something that they didn't get in life, but that is what they wanted to get. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, so I think again the question that there's something that they wanted in life and they could not get. So I think 19th century, you know, if you look at women readership, for instance, it is also about the fulfillment in the imaginative space of their ideas, of their lives. So to be able to see a woman go out and make a living for herself would in the 19th century Europe be a kind of an aspiration of of womankind. So I do feel that in that sense 19th century short fiction is trying to negotiate this kind of ideal real space, you know, where what is desired gets attached with what exists, right? And what exists is also too banal, really. If you think of, you know, very strict categories of realism, it is only that in certain moments of one life, as I said, certain arresting moments in one's life, that certain directions become clear, or life changes direction. So, you know, those moments, those key moments in one's life, if you were to pick them up and offer a kind of an imaginative scope to it, use the kind of language that would accelerate or that would highlight its potentiality. I think that has been the contribution of 19th century short fiction. And 19th century short fiction, therefore, or at least by the time you read Chekhov, you find that the 19th century has short fiction, or the short story as we call it, has become more intellectual, because it's trying to unravel the mind of the character, and then of course it will be taken to newer heights in the 20th century. You could almost say that maybe extreme heights in some cases, where the individual mind becomes the only space of exploration, and the outside world, so to speak, recedes to the background. So there is a kind of a new thing about the short story in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, people also referred to the short story sometimes as a broken novel, a novel which has been broken. But by the time you reach the 20th century, there is the short story does not fear its dissolution anymore. It has already established itself as a genre, and it is here to stay. People see it as a different genre which has different compulsions and a different set of value systems that it foregrounds, unlike the novel. So it has already, I think, created its space in the 20th century by the time you reach the 20th century, and it doesn't, the people don't think anymore that it will lose itself in the novel or in some other form. And you find that 20th century short fiction then is varied and is experimental, in symbolic in turns. So I guess the short story, the evolution of the short story is a very interesting, kind of history. Its history is very interesting because it has emerged from the common experiences of people and goes to the heart of the matter instantly and explores it to the best possible, in the best possible manner by the writer.
Say 2 or 3 sentences about the form of the short story. What would that be then?
So the form of the short story, I think, is one which is of course bound by time and space and by number of words, and has to be in that sense brief, because no word or an incident or a description can exist that doesn't relate to the central essential point or the central problematic of the story. The form of the story is one that compels the writer to stick to that one point, and it actually compels the writer to take a stance on it, which may not be the case in the novel. The novel might take you to different characters and different situations, and the author's viewpoint may somehow be submerged in all of it. But the short story as a form is one which is very close to the vision of the writer, and there how the writer sees the world is what is projected to the reader, and it does not get subsumed in the variety of viewpoints that exist in the novel. So the viewpoint of the writer is very pronounced in a short story, and the authorial stance, the political ideological stance of the writer is more pronounced in the story than in the novel. And it's very interesting, I think, once we go into the whole discussion about about individual writers, you find that the novelists of the 19th century, who otherwise wrote very serious sort of story novels, wrote comic stories. Now, and that novelist, you would never associate that person to be this kind of a short story writer. And this is something that perhaps we will take this up as an exercise once we've gone through the individual stories, and maybe in one of the sum up lectures I would like to take up this question as to how is it that the same author, when this writer writes the novel, then he or she is a completely different person, and when this person's turn to the short story, this person is totally, you cannot identify this person to be that novelist. And what then takes place, that what shift occurs? How does this genre compel the writer to be this kind of person? Because the short story pins the writer, to the issue and to the authorial stance, according to me.
Well, friends, this discussion by Dr. Richa Bajaj can be called a questions galore, and we are supposed to carry those questions with us and to think about them more and more as we read short stories in real life. Thank you.